Imagine approaching Tenochtitlan in the early 1500s, an enormous island city rising from the lake, its temples like stone mountains pointing at the sky. Spanish chroniclers later wrote that the steps of the great temple were slick with dried blood, and that the stench of sacrifice carried on the wind. But to the Aztecs, this was not horror, it was duty. Their world was bound to the gods by blood. The sun, they believed, demanded it to rise each day. The rains needed it to fall. The earth itself drank it to grow crops. And so justice for crime was not merely law, it was cosmic payment. In this brutal order, the line between punishment and sacrifice blurred. To be condemned was not simply to be killed, it was to be offered. The courtrooms of Tenochtitlan sentenced men and women not just to death but to fates that were part execution, part ritual, and part terror designed to keep a population of millions obedient. Spanish soldiers arriving with Cortés in 1519 were hardened men, veterans of European wars. Yet even they were shaken by what they saw. One wrote, "The stones of their temples drank the blood of thousands." The drums sounded like the roar of hell. Before the conquistadors, there was no jail in the Aztec world. Justice was swift, physical, and often public, meant to keep the empire's diverse subjects terrified enough to obey. In the coming parts, we'll walk you through the most sadistic punishments this empire devised. Crimes that earned not just death, but unimaginable suffering. Sentences carried out in public plazas as warnings, and the rituals that turned punishment into sacred theater. But first, we must understand the Aztec view of crime itself. Theft was an insult to the gods. Adultery could anger the rain deities. Drunkenness in the wrong season could doom the crops. Every transgression, even the smallest, was believed to invite disaster on the whole community. The response had to be extreme. That is why Aztec punishments were not hidden behind walls. They were spectacles. The crowd gathered to watch, the priests chanted, the drums thundered, and the condemned often met a death as slow as the climb up the temple stairs. To understand the cruelty of Aztec punishments, you have to picture their courts. There were no dark dungeons or long trials. The accused was brought before judges who sat in open plazas beneath the looming pyramids. Behind them, carved stone gods seemed to watch the proceedings. Guilt often meant not just a sentence, but a journey up the temple steps, the place where the divine and the human met in blood. For common crimes, the punishments were often swift but still terrifying. A thief who stole from the market could be stripped naked, tied to a wooden frame, and beaten until his flesh split open. If he stole again, the second offense often meant death, sometimes by strangulation, sometimes by being clubbed in the public square. The Aztecs believed that repeated theft offended not only society, but the gods who granted abundance, and so it had to be repaid in blood. Adultery was treated as a wound against the entire social order. Men caught seducing married women could be stoned to death, or in some regions burned alive before the temple steps. Women accused of infidelity often met a fate even crueler. Some were strangled and buried beneath their own homes, a grim reminder to all that domestic betrayal would be punished within the walls where it occurred. There were also crimes that today seem almost trivial, but in the Aztec world were mortal sins. A noble found drunk in public, especially outside of religious festivals, could face execution by strangulation. Commoners, if they were lucky, might only be shaved, bald, and beaten before their neighbors, humiliated as a warning. Young people were not spared. Children who were disrespectful or disobedient could be punished by having spikes of maguey cactus pressed into their skin, or by being forced to inhale choking chili smoke until they screamed and wept. It was believed this suffering purified them, burning out the laziness or insolence that angered the gods. Every punishment was public. The plazas became theaters of pain, watched not in silence but often to the sound of drums and chants. The point was not merely to end a life, but to send a message that law and religion were one and the same, and that breaking either meant surrendering your body to the empire's wrath. Even in these punishments for everyday crimes, you can see the Aztec obsession with making the condemned into a kind of offering. Their pain, their blood, their humiliation were part of the balance they believed held the world together. And as the empire grew and wars brought in more captives, the line between justice and sacrifice blurred even further. What most horrified the first Spanish chroniclers wasn't merely the death itself, but the theater of it. The Aztecs did not see punishment as a quiet matter of justice. It was an act to be displayed before gods and humans alike. Prisoners of war bore the brunt of this ideology. Conquest was the lifeblood of the empire, and captives were more than spoils. They were living offerings. But not all were led straight to the sacrificial altar. Some were first condemned to suffer punishments so elaborate and gruesome that the Spaniards would later write of them with trembling hands. A captured enemy who had insulted the Aztec gods or defied tribute could be taken to the central square. Bound to a great stone disc known as the temalacatl, he was given a mock weapon, a wooden sword edged with feathers instead of obsidian, and forced to face one Aztec warrior after another, each armed with real macahuitl blades. The doomed man's struggle was a public performance, his slow defeat a demonstration of the gods' favor for the Aztec side. Others were subjected to punishments that blurred the line between execution and ritual sacrifice. A particularly despised prisoner might be dragged across sharp stones, tearing his flesh, then paraded through the streets while the crowd jeered. Some captives were kept alive for days, their ears or lips sliced off, their bodies painted with sacred colors before the final march to the temple steps. For rebels within the empire, city leaders who refused to pay tribute or broke their oaths, the punishments could be even more degrading. Chroniclers described how some were strangled with cords of maguey fiber in front of their families, their corpses then dismembered and displayed on wooden racks at the city gates. Heads were sometimes impaled on long poles, eyes staring down at those who passed below, a silent warning that rebellion was not only futile but fatal. Even minor accomplices to rebellion were not spared. Some were reportedly flogged until they could no longer stand, then thrown into pits and covered with stones. Others were dragged behind canoes across the shallow lakes that surrounded Tenochtitlan, their bodies lacerated by the jagged reeds and shells until they bled into the water. For the Aztecs, these punishments weren't just about pain, they were about order, cosmic order as well as political order. Each act of suffering was seen as a form of repayment, a balancing of the scales between humans and gods. To resist the empire was not simply to break the law, it was to upset the harmony of the universe. The punishment had to be so terrible, so unforgettable, that it would burn fear into the hearts of all who witnessed it. And so the plazas and temple steps often echoed with cries, not hidden behind prison walls, but carried on the wind for the whole city to hear. The Spaniards who recorded these scenes were no strangers to cruelty themselves, yet they would later describe these punishments as beyond the measure of any Christian land, the work of a civilization whose laws were written in both stone and blood. Among the most dreaded punishments in the Aztec world were those that combined physical torment with religious meaning. Pain itself was seen as a sacred offering, a visible sign that the victim's life force was being given up to the gods. In some punishments, the condemned was bound naked to a stake surrounded by burning copal incense and slow smoldering coals. The heat scorched the skin, and the smoke choked the lungs long before the flames touched the flesh. For the Aztecs, this was a way of purifying the soul before death, a ritual cleansing through suffering. Another terrifying ordeal involved cactus spines. Criminals who stole from the temples or disrespected the priesthood could be forced to kneel on pads of prickly cactus, their hands tied behind their backs. Guards would then press their bodies down, driving the barbed spines deep into the skin. The victim was left there for hours or even days, writhing in agony as the spines broke off beneath the flesh. Rebellious nobles and traitorous warriors sometimes faced punishments that were both symbolic and excruciating. Chroniclers described how some were lashed to tall wooden stakes, then cut with obsidian blades, not to kill them outright, but to wound them again and again. These wounds were daubed with ground chili peppers and salt to keep the pain burning, as priests recited chants calling on the gods to witness the suffering. Some accounts spoke of an especially grim sentence, being flayed alive. While later historians debate how often it was done, there is no doubt that human skin was used in certain Aztec religious rites. Prisoners, particularly those captured during festivals dedicated to Tzopantli, the god of renewal, were reportedly killed and then skinned, their flayed hides worn by priests as sacred garments. Even if the victim was dead before the skinning began, the sight of a priest stepping out onto the temple platform, draped in human skin, chilled both allies and enemies. There were also punishments reserved for sacrilege, defiling the sacred symbols of the gods, or spilling blood in forbidden places. Those accused might be dragged by ropes through the streets until their skin was raw, then tied to a wooden frame and pierced with obsidian-tipped arrows. The body was sometimes left hanging for days, a grim reminder of the cost of sacrilege. What shocked the Spanish witnesses most was not merely the cruelty, but the calm ritual precision with which these acts were carried out. Drums were beaten as the punishments were enacted. Conch shells were blown to call the city to watch, and priests sprinkled burning copal resin as if to sanctify the scene. To the Aztecs, it was order and worship. To the Spaniards, it was a vision of hell. In Tenochtitlan, punishment was not just about the condemned. It was a lesson for everyone watching. The Aztecs believed fear was the foundation of order, and so they made justice a spectacle, unforgettable, terrifying, and sacred. Public squares often became grim theaters. On festival days, criminals and captured warriors were brought before the people in long, chained processions. Drums thundered as they were paraded through the streets, stripped of dignity, painted in sacrificial colors of white chalk and black ash. Sometimes they were forced to wear paper crowns or garlands of flowers, mocking their final moments before agony. One of the most infamous punishments reserved for traitors and repeat offenders was the stone-breaking ordeal. The condemned was tied to a heavy stone slab in the center of the square, while priests and soldiers took turns striking the body with obsidian clubs, not enough to kill immediately, but to shatter bones and tear muscles. The victim often lingered for hours or even days, writhing in pain as citizens passed by and took in the sight. Another public torment that horrified onlookers involved being rolled down the steep steps of the temple pyramid. Criminals, bound hand and foot, were hurled from the top after being beaten senseless, tumbling against the stone edges until their broken bodies lay crumpled at the bottom. For the Aztecs, this act symbolized casting out impurity. For the victim, it was a slow, bone-crushing descent to death. In some cases, particularly during times of famine or war, the punishments became even more brutal. Chroniclers spoke of victims tied to poles and pierced slowly with arrows, not to kill outright, but to prolong suffering. A grim performance of pain meant to appease the gods and warn others of the consequences of defiance. Onlookers cheered or wept, torn between reverence and horror. Even children were not entirely spared. Young thieves or those accused of sacrilege might be brought into the square, their ears or noses cut as a permanent mark of shame. The sight of such punishment burned itself into the memory of their peers, ensuring that even the youngest understood the stakes of defying the law or disrespecting the gods. For the Spaniards who first entered the great city, these punishments were beyond comprehension. To them, justice was harsh but secular. To the Aztecs, it was sacred theater. The punishments were not hidden behind prison walls, but unfolded in the open air, with the city as witness and the gods as the ultimate audience. The message was unmistakable. No one, not even the bravest warrior or the highest-born noble, was beyond the reach of pain and death. The spectacle itself became a weapon, shaping the empire's people as much as the punishments did. In the Aztec world, crime against the state or the gods was never just a matter for earthly courts. Many sentences ended not in a dungeon or a gallows, but on the sacrificial altar. To the Aztecs, this was not only the ultimate punishment, but also a sacred duty, a repayment of blood to the divine powers that they believed kept the sun rising and the world alive. Those condemned for grave offenses, blasphemy, treason, betrayal in war, were sometimes treated as living offerings. They were kept alive but starved, paraded through the streets as a reminder of their fate. Often, they were dressed in the likeness of a god, adorned with feathers and painted with sacred pigments, a chilling mix of reverence and mockery. On the appointed day, the victim was taken to the towering steps of the Templo Mayor, the heart of Tenochtitlan's religious and judicial life. Drums and conch shells filled the air, their rhythm echoing like a heartbeat of doom. The condemned was dragged up the steep stairs, past thousands of silent onlookers. At the summit, priests, their arms painted red and their obsidian knives razor-sharp, performed the act that horrified even hardened warriors. The victim was forced onto a stone slab, arms and legs pinned by 4 attendants. In a swift, practiced motion, the high priest cut open the chest, reached inside, and tore out the still-beating heart. The heart was raised to the sky, an offering to the sun god, and then placed into a ceremonial vessel. The lifeless body was sometimes rolled down the temple steps, tumbling to the base where it lay among the other victims of the day's rites. For lesser crimes, such as repeated theft or sacrilege against sacred objects, the sacrifice could be slower and more elaborate. In certain festivals, condemned individuals were tied to a stake and shot with arrows, in a ritual called the prau, flower death. Each arrow had to be aimed carefully to prolong suffering, piercing limbs and torso, before delivering the final shot to the heart. To the Aztecs, this prolonged death transformed the victim into a worthy offering. Some chroniclers recorded that certain offenders were flayed alive, their skins later worn by priests in ceremonies, symbolizing rebirth and renewal. This punishment blurred the line between justice and religious ritual, turning a criminal's death into both a lesson and a divine act. To the Spaniards who later chronicled these events, these punishments were evidence of monstrous cruelty. But within Aztec society, they were seen as necessary sacrifices, the ultimate way to cleanse sins and sustain the cosmic order. For those who lived under Aztec rule, however, the knowledge that a single transgression could end not just in death, but in a public sacred dismemberment, was enough to keep most in rigid obedience. To the Aztecs, captured enemy soldiers were not merely prisoners of war, they were currency for the gods. Conquest was as much about feeding the heavens as it was about expanding the empire. Every battle was fought, not just to defeat, but to capture, because the captured were destined for a fate worse than a warrior's death on the battlefield. The journey to doom began on the battlefield itself. Aztec warriors used weapons designed not to kill, but to maim and subdue. The macuahuitl, a wooden club lined with obsidian blades, could shatter bones and slice flesh, yet often left a man alive, bleeding and crippled. Victorious warriors dragged their captives back to Tenochtitlan as trophies, living proof of their valor. Once in the city, the captives were paraded before jeering crowds. Many were stripped of armor, bound with ropes, and forced to march through streets decorated for festivals. Some chroniclers described them as being smeared with chalk and adorned with feathers, turning them into grotesque symbols of their coming sacrifice. But before death came humiliation. Warriors taken in great numbers were often forced to take part in public rituals, such as mock battles staged on temple platforms. Armed with a wooden sword or a feathered club, they were pitted against fully armed Aztec soldiers. The outcome was never in doubt. The condemned fought bravely, but they were struck down, captured again, and dragged to the altar, the crowd roaring as if at a grisly sport. Particularly notable were the tlacaxi ceremonies, the flaying of men. Captives, often the strongest warriors of enemy states, were bound to a round stone platform, handed mock weapons, and forced to fight against seasoned Aztec champions. Once exhausted and wounded, they were dispatched, their hearts cut out before the watching masses. The bodies were then skinned, their hides donned by priests and warriors, in a chilling dance of triumph and renewal. Other captives were used to enact symbolic myths. Some were dressed as gods, adorned in gold, turquoise, and feathered headdresses, and treated as divine incarnations for weeks, given fine food and women. But their honor was a cruel prelude. When the chosen festival day arrived, they were led to the temple summit, where their divine role ended with an obsidian blade plunging into their chest. For the Aztecs, these spectacles were not mere punishments, but affirmations of their cosmic mission. For their enemies, the Tlaxcalans, the Mixtecs, the countless smaller city-states, the knowledge of what awaited them if captured filled every campaign with dread. Many warriors chose death in battle rather than the altar, knowing that capture meant becoming a living sacrifice in the heart of Tenochtitlan. To the Spanish conquistadors who arrived decades later, these scenes were among the most horrifying they had ever witnessed. Yet they also revealed why the Aztec military machine was so feared. It didn't just defeat enemies, it turned their strongest warriors into offerings that both honored the gods and terrified any who might rebel. The punishments of the Aztecs were never just about the condemned. They were theater, deliberate performances of power and divine authority. Every heart torn from a chest atop the Templo Mayor, every body flayed and danced in, every captive forced to fight hopelessly beneath the jeers of the crowd, was a message to both subject and rival peoples. Resist, and this will be your fate. This spectacle of terror worked. In the valleys and mountain towns that bordered the empire, the memory of the Tenochtitlan punishments kept tributary states compliant. Farmers and artisans paid their taxes of maize and cotton, and smaller kings bowed to the emperor, rather than risk supplying victims for the altars. The empire's expansion was not built on diplomacy or trade. It was enforced by the shared fear of what awaited the conquered. For the victims, the psychological torment often began long before the knife ever touched their flesh. Captives were paraded before the very temples where they would die. The streets of Tenochtitlan were lined with tzompantli, racks displaying thousands of skulls, a forest of bone that turned every errand or festival into a confrontation with mortality. Prisoners slept beneath these silent witnesses, knowing their heads would one day join the rows. Even in death there was no peace. Flayed skins were hung to dry in temple courtyards. Bodies were cast down the steps of the pyramids to be dismembered or left for the dogs. For the Aztecs, these were not atrocities but sacred acts that renewed the sun, the rain, and the earth itself. For those under their rule, it was a constant reminder that the state could take not only life, but dignity, and even the integrity of the body. When the Spanish conquistadors under Hernán Cortés first marched into the Valley of Mexico, they were not merely confronted by warriors, but by an empire that had weaponized terror. The sight of tzompantli racks, the smell of blood at the temples, and the mass of flayed skins filled them with revulsion. Chroniclers like Bernal Diaz del Castillo wrote of these things with a mix of awe and horror, using them to justify the destruction of the Aztec civilization. But the power of such punishments lingered even after the empire's fall. For decades, Spanish accounts painted the Aztecs as bloodthirsty savages, while for the surviving native peoples, the memory of the old punishments remained a shadow, shaping how they remembered their own ancestors. In the end, the Aztecs' greatest weapon was not the macuahuitl or the obsidian blade. It was the spectacle of suffering. By making death a public ritual and agony a sacred duty, they controlled millions. And even in ruin, the memory of that terror continued to haunt the descendants of both the conquered and the conquerors.